Savannah, a 28-year-old office worker, was living in a one-bedroom apartment downtown. Her home was modest, only furnished with a small fridge, a washer and dryer, and a single bed. She didn't even have a TV, but that's fine with her. She didn't grow up with a lavish lifestyle, so her simple lifestyle as an adult suits her well. When she was a kid, her life wasn't so simple. They may not be rich, but her family belongs to the middle class. However, when her parents died suddenly when she was 15, her comfortable life went down the drain. An estranged aunt and uncle had begrudgingly accepted her into their home, where, as can be expected, she wasn't treated well. As soon as Savannah turned 18, she moved out of her drunken uncle and tactless aunt's home. She found a room to rent, if it can even be called a room with how little it was. But it was fine. She just sleeps there anyway. She juggled work at a local fast food chain and her studies at the university, so she wasn't home much. She studied and worked as if her life depended on it. Except it actually did. She studied during the day, worked at night, and got some sleep here and there. When she finally graduated, she moved out of her rented room into an apartment all for herself. It wasn't a big room by the usual standards, but it was quite big for her given that she'd stayed in a room only big enough for a single bed and a small bedside table. So an apartment, basically a house all for herself, brought Savannah so much bliss. Once she landed a job, she persevered even more so she could live a better life. At work, Savannah was well liked. She was easy and fun to work with. However, Savannah rarely hung out with her colleagues outside work hours, so their lifestyles were worlds apart from hers. Every day she left home at 6 a.m. and would arrive back home around 7 p.m. This is highly dependent on the day's traffic, but she never got home later than 8 p.m. Every time, Savannah would see a homeless man sleeping on one of the darkest streets near her home. She didn't live in an upscale neighborhood, so homeless people here and there were a common sight. But this particular homeless man, whom Savannah thought was close to her age, tugged at her heartstrings. She thought of giving food and/or other stuff, but was usually in a hurry in the morning and too tired at night to remember. Still, the man would be at the back of her mind, and thoughts of him surfaced at times. One day, it was raining on her way home, and she remembered the homeless man. How cold he must be in this weather, she thought to herself. Mustering all her courage as she didn't feel comfortable talking to people she didn't know, Savannah decided to approach the homeless man and offer him blankets and a hot meal. Her hesitation in approaching a man she didn't know, and who was homeless at that, diminished at the sight of the man huddled in the corner. He was desperately trying not to get wet from the rain. "Hi, here's some soup and a blanket to tide you over for the night. Doesn't seem like the rain will let up anytime soon," Savannah said softly. The man looked up at her and reached for the food and blanket, so Savannah saw his hand shake from the cold. "Thank you, you're very kind," said the man. "Well, I'm sorry that's all I can offer," Savannah answered. She couldn't invite the man into her home for several reasons. For one, he was a homeless man she didn't know. She may have known him by sight as she always saw him on her way in and out, but he was still literally a stranger to her. Two, even if she was that naive to invite a man she didn't know over, she had nothing to offer since her apartment is fairly small. "No, this is more than enough, thank you," came the man's answer. "I always thought you were kind whenever I saw you. Although you never stopped by to talk, because why would you, right? But you would always offer a smile whenever our eyes met." Unsure what to do, Savannah just smiled, bid goodbye and left. The next day it was no longer raining hard, although it was still drizzling. Savannah wanted to check on the homeless man, but she was running late since she overslept. So Savannah all but ran to the bus stop. She wasn't even able to spare the man a glance. That night, Savannah made sure to pick up dinner and some bread on her way home. She once again approached the man. This time, the man was seated on one of the bleachers under the streetlight. "Hi, this is for you," Savannah said as she handed him the food. Surprised but immensely grateful, the man accepted the food and flashed Savannah a dazzling smile. Savannah stared momentarily at the man. If he weren't homeless, he'd steal a lot of hearts for sure, she thought to herself. "You didn't have to do this, but thank you, really," said the man. "I'm Nolan, by the way." "Hey, Nolan," Savannah smiled back at him. She stayed there for a few more minutes as she listened to Nolan's stories. "I wasn't always a homeless man. I had what I thought was a thriving business. Since today's economy's a bit fickle, I lost everything. I would have still had my house and car after my business went under, but that would mean my employees wouldn't be able to receive their final paycheck, so I decided to sell everything I owned to make sure they got what they deserved. So, here I am." Nolan told his story, which made Savannah feel different things. Awe at the man who was so selfless he decided to lose everything, and pity for how his life turned out because of this decision. Since that night, Savannah has spent a couple of minutes on the beach outside as she exchanges stories with Nolan. They became close enough, and she became comfortable with him enough that she decided to invite him in for dinner. After that, it essentially became their routine. Once Savannah was home, either she'd whip up dinner or Nolan would. Until one day, Nolan was no longer homeless. The two eventually fell in love, and Savannah let Nolan move in. They were happy. Savannah went to work while Nolan did all the chores. Surprisingly, he was good at it. He cleans thoroughly and cooks really well too. All were good, except the apartment was too small for them. So Savannah took on another job so she could save up to move to a bigger place. Nolan tried looking for jobs too, but so far, nothing. Maybe because he used to be homeless. When Savannah's colleagues heard about this, they told her she was being naive by accepting this man into her home, feeding him, and most of all, falling in love with him. They tried to dissuade her and told her that she was being used, but Savannah stood her ground, and eventually she had a strained relationship with her co-workers. When she had saved enough, Savannah and Nolan found a place they liked very much. It was still a humble home, not too big, but not too small either. Not long after that, Nolan surprised Savannah with the news that he finally found a job. A year into their relationship, Savannah and Nolan planned their wedding. Nolan had no guests to invite, him being homeless and all, and he didn't know his co-workers long enough to have them over on such a special day. Meanwhile, Savannah was excited to invite her colleagues. Despite their previous disapproval, she wanted them to know that Nolan was now going in the right direction and wasn't after her money at all. However, her co-workers still had their doubts, but agreed to go anyway. They wanted to see if Savannah would at least come to her senses before they were officially man and wife. Savannah also sent invites to her aunt and uncle, who didn't reach out to her, which was okay, since she sent them out of courtesy anyway. On the day of the wedding, Savannah's co-workers smirked as soon as they saw her, and she was about to find out why. When she arrived at the church, the groom wasn't there waiting for her, as was customary. The color drained off her face, and instead of comforting her for being jilted, Savannah's colleagues blamed her for being so naive. "We told you numerous times he just needed you for your money," said one. "Which wasn't much anyway," quipped another. She was about to address the people present, and there were just a handful of them really, when a sleek black limousine stopped in front of the church. Nolan got out of the car, and everybody's jaw fell to the floor, including Savannah's. Confused, hurt, curious, and everything in between, Savannah just stared at Nolan, who was walking straight to her. "I'm really, really sorry for being late. I'll explain everything later. Can we get married now?" Nolan told her softly, gently urging her to face the minister. Seeing beads of sweat on her soon-to-be husband's face, she decided to just trust him and asked the minister to begin the ceremony. Her colleagues snickered, rolled their eyes, and whispered to each other. It didn't look like it, but Savannah turns out to be an idiot. Despite their thoughts on the matter, they decided to stay on to watch Savannah make the worst decision of her life. "But how did he turn up here in that car?" someone wondered aloud. "He probably hitchhiked in that limo," said another, and the others guffawed, none too quietly. One of them, however, the one who didn't have any interaction at all with Savannah despite them being on the same team simply because she didn't interact with poor people, noticed that Nolan's entire ensemble was from a very famous Italian designer. As she mulled it over, she realized that Savannah had just finished her vows, and it was Nolan's turn now. Nolan held the microphone and said in a soft but steady voice, "To you, my love, and to all of you present here today, I would like to tell you a story of how I met my now wife, Savannah." As Nolan told the story, eyes bulged and jaws dropped. Yes, including Savannah's. Apparently Nolan was never a homeless man. He was in fact an esteemed businessman, whom Savannah had met before but never really met. One day when the manager's secretary was not in, the manager asked Savannah to attend the meeting with him, as it was a really important meeting with very important people. He didn't want to be the only person there without a secretary. He told Savannah, "But keep your head low. You don't have to do anything, just pretend you're taking down notes or something." So at the meeting, Savannah acted as if she wasn't even there at all. However, Nolan saw her just fine. In fact, they were in the same elevator earlier that day when Savannah chatted happily to an elderly couple who were having a hard time finding out which floor they should get off. Nolan saw what a striking beauty she was, and how kind she was too. Right then, he fell in love. Hard. But with his previous relationship experiences, he was afraid to approach her as he was, so he planned an elaborate scheme to see if Savannah would love him if he was nothing. Nolan was tired of meeting and falling for people who only wanted him for his money. Now he knew he had met and loved the right person. Savannah stood still, unable to process everything at once. But Nolan held her hand and said, "I'm sorry if I had to be that extreme, but with the kind of life I led, I felt it necessary to do so." "But why were you late? Have you changed your mind but decided to have the wedding out of guilt?" were the words that came out of her mouth. "No, of course not. I had car troubles, and the only one available for use is the limo. Sorry for that too." Savannah laughed, almost hysterically actually. But instead of giving way to the anger she started to feel of being duped, she tried hard to understand why Nolan had to go to such lengths, and she kind of got it, although she planned on having him sit down and talk about it in more detail. When they wrapped up the wedding, they all moved to the reception, which was literally straight out of a fairy tale, the one that Savannah had dreamed about as a young girl and told Nolan about in passing. He remembered and actually did it for her. Savannah's heart swelled, and she told herself that this man has a big heart that has been battered and beaten, which pushed him to do what he did. After all the festivities, Nolan drove to a mansion where they will live from now on. Once they were alone, the two talked everything out. Nolan explained everything and asked for understanding and forgiveness. Savannah forgave him, but made sure to tell him that the way he did things wasn't the way she wanted their future decisions to be. Nolan readily agreed, knowing he wouldn't have to go to great lengths again for anything. After all, he had the most important thing in the world wrapped in his arms, and there isn't anything else he'd want, except for maybe a kid or two.